Two university students claimed they were attacked because of their race, but they are now facing charges because the surveillance video tells a very different story. Jelani Moore and Chanel Foster, young and driven, were the best of friends. They became the face of a campus-wide protest, their voices amplified by the outrage of their peers. To anyone who heard their story, they were heroes, standing up against injustice and systemic racism. But behind the banners, the chants, and the headlines, there was a truth hidden in plain sight, a truth that surveillance cameras would later reveal, turning their cries for justice into whispers of regret. Jelani and Chanel met on their first day at university. It wasn't planned, just a chance meeting in the dorm lobby as they each struggled to carry heavy boxes to their rooms. Jelani, always quick to make a connection, introduced herself with a wide grin and an offer to help. From that moment, they clicked. Both young women had come from similar backgrounds, tight-knit Black families, strong-willed mothers, and a deep sense of pride in their heritage. They shared stories of their upbringing, laughing at the similarities. Both had grown up hearing tales of struggle and resilience, passed down from grandparents and parents who lived through difficult times. It wasn't just their pasts that bonded them. Jelani and Chanel shared a curiosity about the world, a hunger to discuss deep, meaningful topics. They spent hours debating politics, culture, and race. They pored over articles about injustices in the criminal justice system and watched documentaries about the civil rights movement. These conversations gave them purpose, a feeling that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Their friendship deepened with each passing month. They became inseparable, always seen walking together on campus or sitting side by side in the dining hall. They supported each other through everything: exam stress, homesickness, and even the occasional drama with classmates. But their favorite conversations were always about racism. It wasn't just a topic for them, it became a passion. They saw themselves as part of a generation tasked with continuing the fight for equality. They talked endlessly about what it meant to be Black in a predominantly white world. They would point out subtle microaggressions they noticed in their daily lives. Small things, like being asked where they were really from, or classmates assuming they were on scholarships because of their race. These moments might have been minor to others, but to Jelani and Chanel, they were reminders of the systemic issues they believed surrounded them. In class, their professors often led discussions on race and society. Jelani always had her hand up first, ready to share her opinion. Chanel wasn't as outspoken but nodded in agreement, backing up her friend's arguments with well-researched facts. Together, they became known as voices of activism on campus, outspoken, intelligent, and unapologetically proud of who they were. At first, their activism was driven by hope, a belief that change was possible. But over time, something began to shift. The more stories they read, the angrier they became. They devoured articles about police brutality, hate crimes, and discriminatory policies. The headlines felt endless, each one more infuriating than the last. Jelani especially began to carry that anger with her everywhere she went. "How can they not see it?" she would ask, her voice sharp with frustration. "How can people just live their lives like none of this is happening?" Chanel agreed, though her anger simmered quietly beneath the surface. She wasn't as quick to voice it, but she felt it all the same, a growing frustration with the world, and more specifically, with white people. At first, it was subtle. They avoided sitting near white classmates in the cafeteria. They stopped making small talk with white professors. They ignored friendly smiles from white peers in the hallway. It wasn't hatred, they told themselves. It was just a way to protect their energy, to stay focused on their goals. But soon, their anger turned into something darker. They started to view every interaction through the lens of race. A white classmate who didn't return a hello was seen as dismissive. A white professor who criticized their work was deemed biased. Even casual conversations felt tinged with an unspoken tension. One evening, as they scrolled through social media together, Jelani paused on a video of a protest gone wrong. Police officers clashed with young Black protesters, and the comments section was filled with hateful, racist remarks. Jelani's jaw tightened. "Do you see this?" she said, holding up her phone. "This is why we can't trust them." Chanel nodded, her expression grim. "It's everywhere," she said softly. "Even here, on this campus, they just hide it better." From that moment, their bond became something more than friendship. It was a shared mission, a determination to call out the injustices they believed surrounded them. They were no longer just students or activists, they saw themselves as protectors of their community. But in their quest to fight against prejudice, they didn't notice how their own biases were growing. They had become so focused on the enemy they imagined that they began to see it in places it didn't exist. And slowly, without realizing it, they were becoming what they claimed to despise. Jelani and Kanel were in high spirits that evening. It was their friend Mariah's birthday, and the small gathering was just what they needed to unwind after a long week of lectures and assignments. The living room of Mariah's off-campus apartment was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of homemade appetizers. Jelani had always been the life of any party, her voice cutting through the crowd as she shared stories and cracked jokes. Kanel, as always, sat nearby, smiling and chiming in at just the right moments. The evening started lightheartedly enough. Mariah's friends played games, danced, and reminisced about the semester so far. But as the night wore on, the conversation shifted. Someone brought up a video that had been circulating online, a protest where a group of young black men had been forcefully detained by the police. The room fell silent as one of the partygoers showed the clip on her phone. The anger in the room was palpable. Jelani's voice broke the silence. "This is why we can't ever let up. They don't see us as equal, and they never will." Chanel nodded, her usual calm demeanor tinged with frustration. "And the worst part is, people will defend this. They'll say it's justified." The conversation spiraled from there. Others chimed in, sharing stories they'd read or experiences they'd witnessed. Jelani and Chanel, already primed by their own convictions, felt their emotions rising. By the time the party began winding down, their usual fire had turned into a simmering rage. As they left Mariah's apartment, stepping into the cool night air, the tension between them and the world felt heavier than usual. They didn't speak much as they walked, their footsteps echoing on the quiet street. The dim streetlights cast long shadows, and the occasional passing car broke the stillness. Jelani finally broke the silence. "You know, sometimes I feel like we're just waiting for it to happen. The disrespect, the moment where they remind us we're less than," Chanel sighed. "It's not if, it's when, and it's always when you least expect it." The quiet returned, but now it was charged, as if they were both waiting for something to prove their point. Far ahead on the street, a white man appeared. He was walking briskly, his head slightly bowed as if trying to shield himself from the chilly night air. He carried a worn briefcase in one hand, his posture heavy with exhaustion. It was clear he had just come from work, his jacket wrinkled, his pace deliberate. Jelani spotted him first. She nudged Chanel with her elbow and tilted her head toward the man. "Look at him," she muttered, her tone laced with disdain, "walking like he owns the place." Chanel glanced at the man but said nothing. Jelani's voice grew louder. "Hey, Whitey!" she called out, her words sharp and mocking. The man stopped in his tracks and turned slightly, his face a mixture of confusion and weariness. He didn't say anything, just looked at them for a moment before continuing on his way. Jelani's voice cut through the quiet again. "What, you don't talk to black people?" she taunted, her tone daring him to respond. Finally, the man spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I don't want any problems. I just want to get home." Chanel, emboldened by her friend, stepped forward. "Too good to talk to us, huh? That's what it is, isn't it?" The man stopped walking. He turned to face them fully, his expression cautious. "Look," he said, his voice steady, "I don't know what you want from me, but I'm not looking for trouble." Jelani stepped closer, her anger now fully visible. "Trouble? Is that what you think of us? That we're trouble?" She folded her arms, her voice growing louder. "You think you can just walk past us like we're invisible? Like we don't matter?" The man took a step back, his hand tightening around the handle of his briefcase. "I didn't say that," he replied carefully. "I just want to go home." But his careful tone only fueled Jelani's anger. "Oh, so we're problems now. That's how you see us, just a bunch of troublemakers." Chanel, who had been watching quietly, now joined in. "Yeah, that's what you're saying, isn't it? That we're not worth your time." The man shook his head, his exhaustion evident. "I didn't say that," he repeated, his voice tinged with frustration. "Please, just let me pass." As he tried to walk away, Jelani moved to block his path. "No," she said sharply. "You don't get to walk away from this." The man, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to step around her. Chanel shoved him back, her push catching him off guard. He stumbled slightly, but regained his footing. "What's wrong with you people?" The man muttered, more to himself than to them. But the words hit like a spark to dry tinder. Jelani's eyes widened. "You people?" she repeated, her voice rising. "That's what you think of us?" Before the man could respond, Jelani shoved him hard. Chanel followed, her own frustration boiling over. The man tried to back away, his hands up in a defensive posture, but the girls pressed on, their anger consuming them. Finally, he pushed back, his hand catching Jelani in the shoulder. She stumbled and fell to the ground, her phone slipping from her pocket. The man froze, his face pale, as if realizing the situation had gone too far. Jelani sat up slowly, her expression shifting. She grabbed her phone and began dialing. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice cold and deliberate. When the operator answered, Jelani's tone changed instantly. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "We were attacked," she said. "He called us slurs and hit us. We need the police. Please hurry." Chanel grabbed Elliot, the white man, by his jacket as Jelani kept him there until the sound of sirens filled the air. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his face a mask of fear and disbelief. The sound of sirens cut through the quiet street, growing louder with each passing second. Jelani and Chanel stood their ground, each gripping onto Elliot's jacket as if to make sure he didn't leave before the authorities arrived. Elliot, still reeling from the confrontation, kept his hands up, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. When the police car pulled up, its flashing lights casting blue and red hues across the scene, two officers stepped out with purpose. Jelani immediately pointed to Elliot, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "That's him," she cried. "He attacked us. He called us slurs." The officers exchanged a glance before turning to Elliot, who shook his head in protest. "I didn't," he began, but Jelani interrupted. "Don't let him lie. He pushed me to the ground. We're lucky we weren't hurt worse." Chanel chimed in, her voice laced with anger. "He thinks he can get away with it just because he's white. You have to do something." The officers approached Elliot cautiously. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," one of them said, their tone firm but measured. Elliot held his hands out in front of him. "Wait, this isn't what it looks like," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "They're the ones who—" "Turn around, sir," the second officer said, cutting him off. They grabbed his wrists and cuffed him without hesitation. Elliot flinched as the cold metal closed around his skin. Jelani and Chanel stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. Their faces moments ago filled with rage, now softened into feigned vulnerability. Jelani clutched her phone tightly, pretending to wipe away a tear. Elliot glanced back at them as he was led toward the patrol car. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But his words were swallowed by the sound of the car door slamming shut behind him. As the police drove away, Jelani turned to Chanel, her lips curling into a small, triumphant smile. "We showed him," she said quietly. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire across campus. Jelani and Chanel wasted no time rallying support. They told their version of the events to anyone who would listen: classmates, professors, and even local reporters who were eager to cover a story that fit the narrative of racial injustice. "We were just walking home," Jelani recounted to a group of students gathered in the quad. Her voice was steady, her words carefully chosen. And out of nowhere, this man started yelling at us. He called us things I can't even repeat. When we tried to defend ourselves, he pushed me to the ground. He didn't even care that we were women. Chanel added, her tone somber, "This isn't just about us. This is about every black student who's ever felt unsafe. Every one of us who's ever been dismissed or targeted because of our skin color." Their words struck a chord. Within hours, a protest was organized. Students gathered in the center of campus, holding handmade signs that read "Black Lives Matter" and "Stop the Hate." Faculty members joined in, holding banners and chanting alongside the crowd. Jelani and Chanel stood at the front of the rally, microphones in hand. Jelani's voice boomed through the speakers. "We're not just here for ourselves," she declared. "We're here for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. We're here to say, enough is enough." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing across the campus. As the protest gained momentum, the campus became engulfed in tension. White students, many of whom felt alienated by the rhetoric, walked cautiously through the quad, their eyes downcast to avoid confrontation. Some whispered among themselves, questioning the truth of the accusations but too afraid to speak up. Others, feeling the weight of the moment, joined the march out of guilt or solidarity. The university administration, eager to show their support, released a statement condemning all forms of racism and promising an investigation. But for Jelani and Kanel, the damage was already done. They were no longer just students. They had become symbols of resistance. From their perspective, they had won. They had turned their anger into action, their voices into a movement. But what they didn't know was that the truth, recorded by an unblinking surveillance camera, was already beginning to unravel their story. Detective Marcy Williams sat at her desk, staring at the case file in front of her. The incident involving Elliot Hayes and the two university students had already made waves. Social media was ablaze with posts demanding justice, and the campus protest had caught the attention of local news outlets. The pressure to act swiftly and decisively was mounting. Marcy was no stranger to these types of cases. She knew how delicate they could be, especially when race was involved. Her first step was to review the available evidence, starting with surveillance footage from the area where the incident occurred. She leaned forward in her chair as the footage began to play on her computer screen. The timestamp indicated it was late at night, just as Jelani and Kanel had described. The two women appeared on the screen first, walking closely together, their movements relaxed. A moment later, Elliot Hayes came into view, walking in the opposite direction. His pace was brisk, and his shoulders were slightly hunched, as if the weight of his day hung heavily on him. Marcy watched as Jelani and Kanel stopped and turned toward him. She could see Jelani speaking, though the footage had no audio. Elliot's body language shifted, his posture stiffened as he tried to walk past them. The situation escalated quickly. Jelani stepped in front of Elliot, blocking his path, while Kanel moved closer to his side. Marcy frowned as she observed Kanel shoving Elliot, causing him to stumble. Elliot's hands came up defensively, and when Jelani pushed him again, he stepped back, clearly trying to de-escalate. Then came the moment that made Marcy's stomach tighten. Elliot, visibly cornered, pushed one of the girls away in an attempt to escape. Jelani fell to the ground. Marcy paused the footage and exhaled slowly. The narrative that had sparked outrage, a white man attacking two young black women, did not match what she was seeing. The evidence painted a very different picture. Elliot had acted in self-defense after being provoked and physically confronted. Marcy replayed the footage several times, her thoughts racing. She knew the racial dynamics of this case were volatile. The protests, the media attention, the demands for justice, all of it complicated what should have been a straightforward investigation. She leaned back in her chair, her hands steepled under her chin. How was she supposed to handle this? She had no doubt about what the footage showed, but presenting it would mean unraveling the narrative that had already taken hold. After a long moment, she picked up her phone and made the call. "Bring them in," she said, her voice steady. "We need to talk." Jelani and Kanel sat side by side in the small interrogation room, their confident demeanor from the protests replaced by a quiet unease. They had been called to the station unexpectedly, and though neither of them voiced it, they both felt a flicker of worry. Detective Marcy Williams entered the room, a folder tucked under her arm. She took a seat across from the girls, her expression neutral but firm. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence hang in the air. Finally, Marcy opened the folder and pulled out a series of still images from the surveillance footage. She slid them across the table. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. Jelani glanced down at the photos, her stomach tightening. The images clearly showed her and Kanel standing in Elliot's path, their postures confrontational. Another photo captured the moment when Kanel shoved Elliot, and yet another showed Jelani falling after Elliot pushed her away. "What is this supposed to prove?" Jelani said, her voice defensive. Marcy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out a laptop and opened the surveillance video. She pressed play and turned the screen toward the girls. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the video. Jelani and Chanel watched as the events unfolded exactly as they had happened. The footage showed them initiating the confrontation, with Elliot's actions clearly in self-defense. When the video ended, Marcy folded her hands on the table. "Do you have anything to say?" Chanel shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes avoiding Marcy's. Jelani, however, leaned forward, her voice sharp. "That doesn't change what he said. You people, you heard that, didn't you?" Marcy raised an eyebrow. "I heard him say, 'What's wrong with you people?' in response to being physically attacked. That's not the same thing as a racial slur." Jelani's confidence faltered, but she quickly recovered. "He still pushed me. He could have hurt me." Marcy nodded slowly. "And the video shows why. You blocked his path, you shoved him, and you didn't stop when he tried to walk away. This isn't an attack, Jelani. It's self-defense." The words hung heavy in the room. For the first time, Chanel spoke, her voice quiet. "We were just trying to stand up for ourselves." Marcy leaned forward, her tone softening slightly. "I understand that, but standing up for yourself doesn't mean creating a situation that puts someone else in danger. This went too far." Jelani crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "So what happens now?" Marcy closed the laptop and stood. "What happens now is up to the system. But I'll tell you this, there's no justice in twisting the truth. If you want to make a difference, you need to start by being honest, with yourselves and everyone else." As Marcy left the room, Jelani and Chanel sat in silence, the weight of the evidence settling heavily on their shoulders. The walls that once seemed so solid around their story were beginning to crack, and the truth was finally breaking through. Elliot Hayes sat in the passenger seat of his wife's car, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. He had just been released from custody, but the weight of the experience clung to him like a heavy coat he couldn't shrug off. For hours he had been treated like a criminal, enduring questions that painted him as someone he didn't recognize. Even now, as a free man, he couldn't shake the fear and humiliation that had seeped into his bones. At home, Elliot's wife, Karen, tried to comfort him. She set a cup of tea on the table in front of him and sat down across from him, her eyes filled with worry. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. Elliot shook his head at first, but after a moment of silence, the words spilled out. "They looked at me like I was some kind of monster," he said, his voice trembling, "like they had already decided I was guilty." Karen reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "But you're not. The truth is out now. People will see that." Elliot looked up at her, his eyes tired. "Will they? Or will I just be another story people forget about next week?" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I've always tried to be fair, to treat everyone equally. But this, it makes you wonder. What's the point of trying when people only see the color of your skin?" Karen's grip tightened on his hand. "Don't let this change who you are," she said firmly. "You're a good man, Elliot. Don't let them take that from you." But as Elliot sat there staring into his untouched tea, he couldn't help but feel that something inside him had shifted. The news broke 2 days later. Someone from the police department leaked the surveillance footage to the press, and within hours, it was everywhere. Social media exploded with debates, the hashtags shifting from justice for Jelani to false accusations. On campus, the reaction was swift and divided. Students who had marched in the protests felt betrayed. Some confronted Jelani and Chanel directly, their voices filled with anger and disappointment. "How could you lie about something like that?" one student demanded during a heated exchange in the quad. "Do you know what you've done to this campus?" Jelani, who had always been quick with a response, found herself at a loss for words. Chanel stood silently beside her, her gaze fixed on the ground. The protest, once a symbol of unity and resistance, fizzled out almost overnight. Banners were taken down, and students who had once chanted in solidarity now avoided making eye contact with the pair. Even their closest allies distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the fallout. In class, professors who had supported their cause avoided the topic altogether. their previous encouragement replaced with awkward silence. Jelani and Cannell found themselves isolated, the whispers of their peers following them wherever they went. For the first time since they'd met, the weight of their actions began to settle on them. The world they had once felt so empowered to change now seemed like a much lonelier place. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Jelani and Chanel sat at the defendant's table, their expressions a mix of fear and regret. The charges against them, third-degree assault and filing a false police report, had brought them here. Across the room, Elliot sat with his wife, his posture stiff. He had been reluctant to come, but his wife convinced him it was necessary. "You need to speak your truth," she had told him. When it was Elliot's turn to speak, he rose slowly and approached the stand. The room seemed to shrink as his voice filled the space. "I don't hate them," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "But I can't ignore what they did to me. That night, I was just trying to get home. I didn't deserve to be treated like I was less than human, to be dragged into something I didn't do." He paused, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "But I also don't think this is just about me. We live in a world where people are angry, and they have every right to be. But that anger, it can't justify lies. It can't justify hurting someone else just because you think they're the enemy." Elliot's words hung in the air, and for a moment, even the judge seemed moved. The defense lawyer for Jelani and Cannell rose to speak. He painted a picture of two young women caught in the overwhelming weight of societal pressure. "They made a mistake," he admitted, "but this wasn't born out of malice. It was born out of frustration, out of a lifetime of feeling unseen and unheard." The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable. When the session ended, she announced the verdict: guilty, but with a sentence of probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. Weeks later, Jelani and Chanel sat on a bench near the campus quad, watching students pass by. The whispers had died down, but the stares remained. "I keep thinking about when we were kids," Jelani said quietly. "How simple everything seemed back then." Chanel nodded. "We didn't have to think about the world so much. It was just us and our families." The conversation drifted into memories of their childhoods, moments of subtle prejudice they hadn't understood at the time. A teacher who ignored their raised hands. A neighbor who always locked their doors when they walked by. "We let all of that build up," Jelani said after a long silence. "And instead of doing something real about it, we just lashed out." They both knew an apology wasn't enough, but it was a start. The next day, they stood in front of a small crowd on campus. Jelani spoke first, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We made a mistake," she began. "We hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and we let down the people who believed in us." Chanel followed, her voice softer but just as sincere. "We can't undo what we did, but we can promise to learn from it, and we hope one day we can earn back your trust." The crowd was small, but their words carried weight. For the first time in months, they felt a glimmer of hope, not for redemption, but for the chance to do better moving forward. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, and staff filling every seat. A microphone stood in the center aisle, ready for anyone brave enough to step forward. The university had organized this forum in the wake of the incident, hoping to address the tensions that had spread across campus. The forum began with a moderator introducing the theme: racism, accountability, and empathy. The goal was to foster healing, not division, and to create a space where people could share their perspectives without fear of judgment. A black student stood up first, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I came to this school hoping to find a community where I felt safe. After what happened, I don't know if I feel that anymore." Next, a white professor shared her experience. "As someone who has worked here for years, I see how easy it is to fall into assumptions on all sides. We need to work harder to understand each other, not just react to what we think is true." One by one, voices filled the room. Some were angry, others reflective. A Muslim student spoke about the prejudice she faced. A Hispanic staff member shared his hopes for a more inclusive campus. The stories were raw and honest, each one adding another layer to the conversation. In the back of the room, Elliot Hayes sat quietly. He hadn't planned to attend, but came at his wife's insistence. He listened intently as people shared their stories, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The wounds were still too fresh. He felt like an outsider in a discussion that had started because of him, but no longer seemed to be about him. When the forum ended, the crowd dispersed slowly. Some people stayed behind, forming small groups to continue the discussion. Elliot remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty microphone. Then, without a word, he stood and walked out, his expression unreadable. Jelani and Chanel's first day of community service was quiet. They were assigned to work with a local organization that focused on racial unity, teaching workshops and organizing events to promote understanding between different communities. Their supervisor, a kind but firm older woman named Mrs. Harper, wasted no time putting them to work. "You're here to learn as much as to help," she said. "We've all made mistakes, but the question is what you're going to do about them." The girls spent their days listening to stories from people of all backgrounds, stories of pain, resilience, and hope. Slowly, they began to see the complexities of the issues they had once viewed in black and white. They started to understand that empathy wasn't about choosing sides. It was about seeing people as individuals, not categories. Meanwhile, Elliot tried to rebuild his sense of normalcy. He returned to work, though he noticed how his coworkers avoided mentioning what had happened. At home, his wife and daughter did their best to support him, but he still felt a lingering sense of unease. One day, as he walked through the park near his house, he stopped at a bench and sat down. Watching the children play on the swings, he felt a small, unexpected sense of peace. He knew he couldn't erase what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't let it define him. Racism is never black and white. It's a complex web of emotions, experiences, and misunderstandings. It can blind us, divide us, and turn us into the very thing we claim to stand against. Jelani and Chanel learned this lesson the hard way, but they also learned the power of accountability and growth. Elliot, though scarred by the experience, found strength in moving forward and holding on to his core values. While fighting for justice, we must ensure we don't lose sight of what truly matters: empathy, understanding, and the courage to see each other as human beings, no matter how difficult it may be. Here brings us to the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story or were touched by it, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced racism or witnessed it? Share your thoughts or experiences in the comment section below.